Hello, I'm Karen Pascal. I'm the Executive Director of the Henri Nouwen Society. Welcome to a new episode of Henri Nouwen, Now and Then. Our goal at the Henri Nouwen Society is to extend the rich spiritual legacy of Henri to audiences around the world. Each week we endeavor to bring you an interview with someone who's been deeply influenced by the writings of Henri Nouwen, or perhaps even a recording of Henri himself. We invite you to share the daily meditations and these podcasts with your friends and family. Through them, we continue to introduce audiences to Henri's writings, his encouragement, and of course, his reminder that each of us is a beloved child of God. Now, let me take a moment to introduce today's guest. I am delighted to have the opportunity to speak with Father Ron Rolheiser. Ron is the author of 14 books and a person I consider to be the leading scholar and interpreter of Henri Nouwen. At a recent celebration honoring Ron's retirement as president of the Oblate School of Theology in San Antonio, his editor Robert Ellsberg summed up Ron's ministry in this way. The impact of his writing, his retreats, and his ministry comes from his deep knowledge and identification with the human condition. That fact that he has been where we are, whether in a hole or on a mountaintop, in love or in pain, in suffering or in joy. Whatever the situation, wherever we may find ourselves, we sense that Ron Rolheiser has been there himself and that he knows the way that leads to God. Today's talk with Ron is so worth listening to, but up front I need to give you an apology. My audio wasn't properly recorded, so some of the questions will be a bit garbled. Please put up with it, stick with it, because what Ron has to offer is really worthwhile. Ron, I love your books, and they are full of wisdom that leads us into the presence of a loving and compassionate God. With retirement, you're kind of at a new beginning yourself. Can you tell us what has captured your heart and mind at this point?
In our business, and you're in the same business of spirituality, we never really retire. We just move to different phases. And in fact, the interesting thing is, the work we're doing, like you're doing in spirituality, you're much more effective at 70 than you were at 50 or 30, So basically, it's a shift in work. So I'm leaving administration, which I've done now for almost 30 years, or basically 30 years and so on, where I've tried to keep writing and doing some academics. So now I can go back full time to writing, to reading, to researching, to helping students. So I'm much looking forward to it. So it's kind of the end of all the hours I have to put into administration. And so it's a shift in work, not a retirement.
I found it fascinating what you're choosing to do. Like, you're going to finish a trilogy. There's this wonderful book that Holy Longing and then Sacred Fire. But there's a book that you're picking up now that you feel kind of completes that. Tell us a bit about that, because in a sense that really struck a note with me.
Well, Karen, as you know, I wrote the book, The Holy Longing and Sacred Fire, but clearly as the first two books in the trilogy. See, so The Holy Longing is a book about basically how do you set your life together? Like fundamentally, what's fundamental discipleship? And then the Sacred Fire is how do you give your life away? How do you spend your generative years and so on? Now, the book I want to write now called, Insane for the Light, is a book about how do you give your death away? How do you live your last years, that your goodbye to this planet and your family is really something that leaves everybody in deep peace. So it's I actually got the idea from Henri Nouwen. Nouwen wrote this book, Our Last Greatest Gift, in terms of, and he coined an expression, how do you give your death away?
Yeah.
During our generative years, you struggle to give your life away, but then how do you give your death away? So it's a concept I got from Nouwen, but it's very deep in scripture, like Jesus who gives his death to us and his passion. And it's also very clear in the mystics, John of the Cross. That's what John of the Cross would call the dark night of the spirit. The last phase of your life, it's no longer, in fact, I can quote Henri in this. Henri says, there comes a time in your life when the question is no longer, the big question is no longer, what can I do to still make a contribution? But the question is, what can I do now that when I die, when I go away, my death will be the optimal blessing for my family, the community, and the church. So you don't stop living, but you start living in such a way that um, you're giving something else to your family and people now.
It was interesting to me that obviously, as soon as I saw that, it leaped off the page that this was something that Henri had spoken of. Do you think with Henri that he had to have that near-death experience and begin to think in terms of how what the end of his life was going to be? I'm sure he wasn't anticipating it being as short as it was, but in those last years, it was very much an understanding he brought to the situation, which in a way really prepared him for when on his deathbed, what he wanted to give out to everybody was to say how grateful he was, how thankful he was for them, which is an amazingly freeing, liberating thing to say. You owe me nothing, and I grace you with my love and with my thanks.
Well, it's interesting that Henry's near-death experience did two things in his life, massive, I think, transformative things. The one which is, and probably they're linked together, but how Henry in his life always struggled to actually receive love, you know, um, and then whatever this death experience did to him, afterwards he was able to receive love, and that's when he wrote those wonderful books about being God's beloved and so on. But in its own way, it also prepared him for death, because he had kind of literally died at one point, and but see, so it prepared him so that even though he died young, um, he did the things he needed to in his last years. That when he died, okay, you're working on his legacy, but he really didn't leave any unfinished business. When you die, oftentimes there's what I should have said or whom I should have still visited. So Henry, in a certain sense, didn't leave any incompleteness, even though he died at this young age.
That is really something. I mean, your book really challenged me because I look at where I'm at in life, and obviously this is something I consider. This issue of being past the generative time of your life or entering into a time in which the passion, the passivity of Christ becomes something. The whole message of unless a seed fall into the ground and die. This is pretty profound. You're going to take us down that path, aren't you?
Yes, and it's a distinction. Let me just talk about it with Jesus. Um, it's a distinction we don't easily pick up, but once it's pointed out to you in Scripture, you'll see it. That we say Jesus gave his life for us, and Jesus gave his death for us, as if that's one movement. No, that's two movements. Jesus gave his life for us through his activity. He gave his death for us through his passivity. And it's interesting. In Mark's gospel, scholars point out that all the verbs about Jesus before he was arrested and led away, all the verbs are active. He taught, he walked, he healed, he preached, and so on. He was the doer. And after he's arrested, all the verbs are passive. They led him away, Pilate questioned him, so on. See, so he gave his life for us through his activity. He gave his death for us through his passivity, through what, for what he endured. And that's a great mystery. And Henry was one of the first contemporary writers to really pick up on that. Remember way back, I think it was about 1975, so that's almost 50 years ago, when he did that series of tapes for Ave Maria Press on waiting. And when he talks about visiting his man who was dying of cancer, and so he takes Henry's hand and he says, Henry, Father, you got to help me. He says, I know I'm dying, but this passivity, what can I do with it? They're, nurses and bedpans and so on. And Henry said, I sat by his bedside and I kept reading the Passion over and over to him, the Passion of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and saying, this is your passivity. You've given your life through your activity. Now you've got to give something through your passivity, in absorbing this. Now, granted, that isn't always a great consolation when you're lying in bed dying or sick, but it's the only thing there is, so the way back, that was before Henry articulated more into a complete spirituality, but he did a wonderful series of talks. I got him, when we still had cassette recorders and on Ave Maria Press, but there were two talks he gave on waiting, what it means to wait. That was the first time I got this notion of passivity. So the book I'm writing it works a lot on that, but it's going to work on some other things too. Is um, how do you experience faith during those years? Like what are dark nights and so on.
We all hope we won't have them, but we
Yeah.
will. In some ways, for some people right now, they're in the midst of a dark night just because the pandemic has
Yeah.
swept away the world they could control.
Yeah.
What are you finding that you can offer out at this point, Ron, into that kind of reality?
And that's probably the hardest thing you could ask me, in terms of, there's a certain helplessness. And, like, for instance, the pandemic hasn't affected me a lot like other people. So, for instance, the same thing, our work goes on. We're not worried about paying our bills and so on. Nobody close to me has gotten ill and died, and so it's almost like I feel guilty speaking as an outsider to people, where this is really, it's taken away their livelihood, or it's taken away their mother or their father or their daughter and so on. Um, it's really a transformative, it's a passion moment for our culture, you know. Um, and it's really tough because, our generation, we have many other good points, but unlike our grandparents and so on, we're not used to this. We're not used to hardship. Our grandparents and stuff, and they lived more vulnerable lives, and they were closer to the earth, but dare I say it, we've become pretty spoiled and pretty soft in our lives. And so when something like this comes along that, or I'd say something else here too, we were under the illusion that we could control life, that nothing like this could happen to us. And along comes this little virus, which we can't do a thing about, and so even that admitting of our helplessness, it's really scarred our psyche. I think that's, and it's been hard. I feel for people who have suffered this in a much deeper ways than I have. I mean, I've been inconvenienced. I can't fly or give talks or something. That's minor, that's it's not like losing, your husband or your wife or a child or your father, or like losing your livelihood and not knowing how you're going to pay your bills, um, but it's I think, there's a thing in spirituality, Karen, where we understand things by looking back at them. We're going to understand this much more when we reflect on it. Um, when we understand divine providence, looking backwards, we're going to see what we learned from this.
I've always loved those moments when we as a world are joined together. I think about the happy moments. It's New Year's Eve, or it's something like the Olympics or something like that. And I feel like we're watching with each other worldwide. We've never been through a tragedy that we're so with somebody who's in India, somebody who's in Korea, someone who's in England. There's a universality of this moment that it really does stop us short. We thought we had it all in control, and suddenly you realize it can go like that. Profound.
The other tragic thing that's happened, I'm living in the United States right now, is, and I suspect some other countries are better, but it also politically divided us. For whatever reason, like you'd think tragedy should unite a nation. It's deeply, deeply divided the United States between, who's wearing a mask and who isn't, and what's a political statement and so on. And that's a second tragedy to this. That, tragedy normally brings a family together. This tragedy has torn this family even further apart as a nation, so that, to walk on the street with a mask or no mask is a political statement that upsets people either way. That's a compound to the tragedy.
I was curious about one thing. What I was wondering about was what does come out of that time. You mentioned the word character. Can you say a little bit more about that?
Let me give you a metaphor, which I very much love, and that's Abraham and Sarah. Like, okay, obviously this is partly metaphorical. So that when she's 70 and he's 80, God says, set out for a country where you don't know where you're going. And when you get there, you're going to have a baby. Then it takes another 20 years. Then when she's 90, he's 100, they have their real child, kind of gray-haired postmenopausal pregnancy, Well, that's a great image for you. What are we called to see during the early generative parts of our life? For instance, you were married, you were a mother, you're raising kids, you're in a job, and so on, you're paying mortgages. It's pretty clear what you're doing, Then at a certain point, you become a grandparent, and a lot of people move into retirement and so on, and they're still young in a way. You today, 70 is the new 50, so you might gonna live maybe 20 more years of healthy life. What are those years for? Well, that's for you to have your Isaac. What's your gray-haired pregnancy and so on. So it's what I call late generativity. In fact, we have a program here now at the school called Forest Dwelling, which is a program like a living school where we bring in people for over a 2-year period off and on, to precisely look at that. What are those years for? I mean, they're meant to be enjoyed. That people enjoy their grandkids and people enjoy leisure and travel and golfing, but none of them are a full-time vocation. Now, a person like yourself or myself, we keep working, but for most people, their work stops. And so what's the new baby they're supposed to have? I call it second generativity. We all understand first generativity, raising kids, paying a mortgage, being involved in the community and doing all this. And that ends at a certain point, and there was a very good book written way back in the mid-90s by Germaine Greer, the British feminist, called The Change. And it's a book on women's menopause, but it's a powerful book where she talks about even like for instance, menopause as a kind of a second puberty. See, puberty as biological and emotional changes that launches you into adult life. Then menopause ends a certain phase, and there's biological changes and psychological, which, it's like a new puberty to launch you into the next phase of your life, and so on. Now, she captures that for women, men who don't have menopause, or at least they don't admit it, they can pretend longer and so on. But really, and again, getting back to Henri was the first person who started naming this in popular writing. Then, of course, people like Richard Rohr and myself and so on started working on this as a spirituality, But Henri was the first person to, first of all, nibble at its edges. Then, at a certain point with his book, Our Last Greatest Gift, to name it explicitly and just saying, how do you give your death away, and what does that mean?
With Henri, you were a person who, as I read your writing, I go, you are like a Henri. You write like a Henri. Write with wonderful passion and soul and good spirit. And I love that. How was it you found Henri, and how did he shape you?
Well, Henri kind of found everybody, No, I'll tell you how I found Henri. I was in graduate school in the early 70s, and young priest, and trying to write, and trying to write. I was doing my master's thesis on the theme of loneliness, and you just kind of restlessness in people's lives and so on. And earlier in that, I had read one book by Henri, which was that book he did on With Open Hands, which someone had given to me as the ordination present. It's a beautiful book because it's simple and short and so on, but deep and so on. But then when I was in grad school, that year, Henri wrote a series of articles in the National Catholic Reporter, which later became his book, Reaching Out. And, I often say this to people, they have all this experience. It was like being introduced to myself. Like that series of articles, which later became, I think, still one of Henri's great books, Reaching Out, which I think he did in 75, with the three movements of the spiritual life, from loneliness to solitude, from hostility to hospitality, from fantasy to prayer. It was like, it was explaining me to me. And then after I became a fan, I started looking up everything he wrote, and it wasn't easy to read everything he wrote, because Henri wrote a lot. But I think I basically read most everything. And but that, Karen, that was my initial hook. And I read this, I want to read this guy. Like he's speaking about what's moving inside of the human person, and also like Henri, and I think we're recognizing now, Henri invented a new language for writing spirituality, you know. See, prior to that, spirituality was written in the, you had two kinds. You had like the classical imitation of Christ and, Francis de Sales. And then you had like Fulton Sheen and Our Sunday Visitor, not that that was bad. But see, Henri really invented a language, which is kind of direct and which he purified during his time. Like it's interesting when you read Henri's earlier books, he still uses a fair amount of psychological terms and so on. Later on, he purges that completely. It's just straight language of the heart. Doesn't use the word narcissism anymore or depression. No clinical terms, just bang, which is a language many of us can imitate and use.
I love, funny, it's where I find a meeting of you and your writing and Henri, and it is this language of the heart. And I think you share that gift. And it's interesting because you have that academic look at it that has the overview and says that you can see this movement in Henri's writing, and I think that's quite wonderful. I jumped out of asking you, what do you have right now that you are birthing in this that you feel God is calling you to? And there must be some impossibility to that. Some sense, in some ways, everything that surrounds your life makes it very possible for you to keep writing and teaching, etc. But there's also the reality of challenges I'm sure that you face. Tell me, what is the Isaac that you are called to birth right now?
I'll get very personal here. My dream had been, or fantasy, part of which was fired by Henri, See, Henri always had this thing about, he understood the dark night of the spirit. And see, the dark night of the spirit is that at a certain point you disappear, like you become a nobody, except Henri could never quite pull that off, remember he went to the Trappist and that didn't work, went to South America, that didn't work, and he went to L'Arche and it kind of worked, but he was still flying all over the world and so on, but he was, I got to disappear, And so my dream had been to, once I retire, quotation marks, that I would go to a Trappist monastery, and kind of still write but disappear. And actually cancer did that in, so now I'm 73, I have cancer, no Trappist is going to take me. For first, it wouldn't be fair to go there, So now I have to, I'm looking to teach and write and so on. But then also, not that I'm looking forward to this, but when my time comes to die, and who knows when it's going to be, I'm on cancer treatments right now, that my Isaac would be to do that in such a way with grace, with humor, with, to give your death away in a real sense.
You're obviously very honest with yourself about where you're at.
Yeah. Well, again, and I'm sorry I keep coming back to Henri, but remember, Henri made a distinction between your achievements and your fruitfulness. And at a certain point in life, your achievements stop, or at least they diminish and so on. But the whole idea is that your fruitfulness can increase. That means, the effect of what you've done and so on. But the thing I want to inject here is to also, I want to answer your present question a little bit with your other question. What's to be my Isaac, John of the Cross, who's been one of my great mentors. And John of the Cross says, see, there's two ways you can enter the dark night of the spirit. So if you can enter it voluntarily, where you do something, like Henri, I'm going to go and join L'Arche or something. I'm going to start my life at Harvard and Yale and so on. Or it can happen to you conscriptively, which means you go to a doctor's office, he says you've got cancer and you're going to die and so on. See, then you enter the dark night of the spirit. See, so that also circumstance will often dictate what your Isaac's going to be, See, there's a certain luxury in picking, I'm going to do this, I'm going to go to a monastery or something. But for most people, it's more humble. It just happens to them. Your mother gets sick and you got to take care of her. This happens, that circumstance or an illness or something does it to you. John of the Cross said, it puts you in the night of the spirit. You can go there on purpose or often for most people, their Isaac is going to be dictated by circumstance. Something's going to happen, you know. Um, and that is why, remember, there was an older spirituality. My mom and dad lived with that. It was what they called the duties of state. And they really believed that if you're faithful and you're honest, what happens in your life will be your vocation. It'll show you what God wants from you, so that you don't have to go into this tournament. What do I do with these years and so on? Stuff will happen, and you're driving. There's a car accident in front of you. You got to stop.
What do you think Henri would have said if he was with us in this conversation today, given the times we're living through, given the pandemic? Do you think he'd have anything to offer into this situation? Does something come to mind to you?
Yes, except on these things, Henri always came up with something novel that was wonderful, and that's why I can't guess what it would be, because it would have been Henri would have written some articles in this. I'm sure that would have been deeply, deeply insightful about what this is calling us to, how it touches our wounds, but precisely the reason, Karen, I can't answer that question, because if I could, then I could write it myself. But Henri always had that was his genius. He could, in these situations, he would write something that would nail it. It would just nail it. And then after he said it, then you say, I should have thought of that. But you don't think of it, But the reason I can't answer that, because that was part of Henri's unique genius.
Do you have a favorite book of Henri's, or do you mentioned reaching out? Are there others that you particularly love to go back to? Or
well, I'm going to go with when they talk about writers, they talk about the early and the late. There's the early Henri, in his early life, the books that I felt were genius, pure genius, was that first very simple book with open hands, but then his book Reaching Out. A lot of his other stuff was built off of that. I think he did one in 1971 or 70, the other one in 1975. So that's a lot, And then in his late works, of course, the ultimate is, Return of the Prodigal Son, but also the book he wrote when he was in the clinic in Winnipeg, The Inner Voice of Love, and so on. All his books were good, but those would be my favorite. The Wounded Healer, it's still the concept that was really Henri's, probably his earliest book, which kind of got him at Notre Dame and Harvard and Yale and so on. There was again, one of his genius insights and so on. But it's one of his earlier books where he still has a lot of psychological stuff in it and so on. It's still not, it's vintage Henri insight, but not vintage Henri writing, But with open hands, reaching out, and then of course the Return of the Prodigal Son, which is this masterpiece, But a hidden little book of his that's really good is that book, The Inner Voice of Love. When he's is sorting through a clinical depression, and he just, how he tries to show that your heart and soul are stronger than your wounds. It's basically, that's the thesis of the book. No matter how deeply wounded you are, your heart, you're stronger than your wounds. I thought of a line which is very, very powerful. In the musical Les Miserables, when the Cosette's mother dies. Remember, she's the factory worker and everything works against her. And in her dying song, she says, "There are things you can't overcome. There are things, like she says, there's darkness you can't overcome." And see, and that seems to be so true. And Henri struggled there with real darkness. No, but in the end, you are stronger than your wounds. And that's the power of that book. That's a great book. And he has some vintage passages that you can copy out, on that.
We're coming up to an anniversary. It will be 25 years in 2021 since Henri died. And it was interesting, when I started as the executive director, I thought, people still need Henri? Is there still and what I'm finding is there is a thirst for what he has written. There continues to be this, and perhaps even more so during this pandemic. We've found, in a sense, with the daily meditations going out, we hear from so many saying, this is just what I need. It speaks into my life right now. I'm grateful for that. We have plans for the year, and I hope people will kind of follow along. We'll let you know what's going on. One of our special plans is we're inviting you to come and be our keynote speaker at the conference we have planned for the beginning of June. It's June 4th and 5th, and it's called Henri Nouwen and the Art of Living. And it's actually a launch of 5 little booklets that are going to be really about building spiritual formation in the now in our lives. It's for small group use in churches and individually and that sort of thing. And we're quite excited about it. But I'm delighted you're coming for that event for us. I noticed on your schedule, you've got a lot of wonderful things coming up. Would you like to share with us some of those things? Because I'd love to promote ways in which people can get to hear you teaching and preaching.
In early February, I think it's 7th to the 12th or something, I every year I give a national retreat. Like normally it'd be in person. This year it's going to be online, And this year I'm doing the incarnation, like the whole body of Christ, what it means, and so on. And they could get that off our website. I think the dates are the 7th of February to, but it's a national retreat, and usually we get 150 people here from all over the United States and Canada. So this year the whole thing will be online. I am looking very much forward to this Nouwen conference. He may be dead for 25 years. He's not dead. Karen, he's still just this huge influence in my life and the lives of many people. So any chance I get to go and speak about Henri or to kind of promote what he's done, I take it. It's a favor to me, not to the other people, and so on. So now I think people sense that I'm not a groupie, but I'm a person who really wants to promote his work, because there is still, I always tell people, you want to be introduced to yourself, start reading Henri Nouwen.
I think that's why you find in Henri a comrade, somebody who has taught you. I think you have learned how to take that voice and bring it out. And I love that about you, Ron. I really enjoy it.
I want to thank you for the work you're doing. That's important work. Henri needs to stay alive.
Amen. Looking forward to having you with us in June.
Okay, thanks, Karen.
Take care.
Okay, bye.
Thank you for listening to today's podcast. Ron Rolheiser has given us a vision for how to live our lives fruitfully, even in the midst of a COVID pandemic. Father Ron Rolheiser is going to be the keynote speaker for our 25th anniversary online conference, scheduled for June 4th and 5th. The conference is called Henri Nouwen and the Art of Living. I hope you'll join us for this very special virtual gathering. Details of how to register for this and many other special webinars we have planned for 2021 can be found on our henrinouwen.org website. For more resources related to today's podcast, click on the links on the podcast page of our website. You can find additional content and book suggestions. If you've enjoyed this podcast, would you take time to give us a thumbs up or a good review? We also want to encourage you to pass on this podcast to your friends and family. Thanks so much for listening. Until next time.
Thanks so much for watching. Be sure to subscribe, give us a thumbs up, or follow us on social media for more Henri Nouwen content. For books, videos, and other resources, or if you'd like to receive free daily Henri Nouwen e-meditations, you can follow the links below.